With spooky season upon us and that ridiculous summer cast into the shadows, it is now time for us to make the cosy descent into the autumnal months. And the first pit stop along the way is to talk about spooky things, because October and that. And that is why over the next 4 weeks I will be talking about exclusively spooky Doctor Who stories. But I've narrowed down the criteria just a little bit more because there's all kinds of spooky in Doctor Who. There's alien spooky, body horror spooky, mad scientist spooky, space spooky, etc, etc. So for these videos I'm going to be doing spooky and also gothic. Obviously the word gothic covers a lot of different things, from art to music to literature to the subculture created around music, lifestyle and fashion, but as far as I can tell, one of the primary definitions of gothic relates to a European style of architecture in the Middle Ages, and this feeds nicely into some of the Doctor Who stories that I'm going to cover. It's all about aesthetics and mood, but it also pertains to styles of buildings, big mansions with dark oak wood and creepy windows and pointy roofs. Perhaps when I'm covering these stories I'm hijacking the term gothic and transferring it over towards something that it is not, because even when you get the gothic dark mansion style of Doctor Who stories, it's usually spliced in with some kind of science fiction element, and yet there is a distinct vibe where you watch it and think, yeah, there's a bit of gothicness to that. Anyway, in distrust in my own ability to understand what the term gothic truly meant, I put this question to you, the humble viewer. I asked you what you consider to be the most spooky / gothic classic Doctor Who's TV story of all time, and the answers came flooding in. There were some very interesting results. There were a couple of episodes that recurred time and time and time again, and they were definite no-brainers, and they were ones that I assumed that you guys would pick anyway, but there were also some wild cards and some slightly more obscure suggestions as well, so I'm very grateful to everyone who chipped in and helped me along the way in choosing these particular stories. I also added an extra stipulation that I didn't tell anybody about, and I apologise for that, maybe I should have mentioned it, but I decided pretty early on that I wasn't going to cover stories that I've already done somewhere on this channel. So despite the fact that people had nominated The Demons and The Curse of Fenric and The Image of Fendel, which are all definitely gothic in their own right, you can find coverage of these episodes somewhere on my channel already. I decided that I was going to do adventures that I have never done before, just to keep things a little bit more fresh and interesting for myself and for you, the viewer. So without further ado, let's talk about the first nomination. It was an outright winner and was requested lots of time, and to be honest, I knew you guys were going to pick this one. It is gothic, spooky, and also contains lashings of surreal. And if I'm perfectly honest, I really do not know where to start with this one. Let's just get into it. It was a story written by a man who at that point had no other writing credentials in the world of Doctor Who, but would later go on to write one of Big Finish's most beloved Doctor Who stories. The plot of this is penetrable if you watch it enough times, but the question I ask humble viewers, is that even the point? I am, of course, talking about 1989's Ghostlight. I've said it more than once and I'll say it more than once again, the Sylvester McCoy era of Doctor Who has aged fantastically as far as I am concerned, and it is a completely unique beast in the history of Doctor Who. There's no other era like it. The layers of metaphor and allegory stacked upon some of the adventures are more numerous than anything that came before the McCoy era, and quite frankly anything that came after. You be the judge of whether that's a good thing or not, but for me it adds such an interesting dimension for this particular tenure of Doctor Who, and some of these stories I've covered on my channel before. I talked about The Greatest Show in the Galaxy and how there was a kind of metatextual quality to it. I theorised about how it was a sort of cynical parody of Doctor Who, and how the gods of Ragnarok represented the audience watching the TV show and almost foreshadowing its eventual demise. And then you've got stories such as The Happiness Patrol, where the main villain, Helen A, was an open representation of Thatch. And there's also a lot of suggested, hypothesized symbolism of the trials and tribulations of being a gay person in 80s Britain. The list goes on, and when certain stories weren't being representative of specific things, they were instead being so surreal and brimming with bizarre charisma that they were open for interpretation in any number of ways. And I think this is what Ghostlight is. It's a kind of Rubik's Cube, a puzzle box which you can dive into and find your own meaning within. There are many ways that I think this story can be interpreted, and I suspect there are numerous theories as to what it's all about. I mean, there is a literal linear plot to this. There is a journey from A to B, and it does have a beginning, middle, and an end, and you can interpret what is going on, but it takes a bit of doing. I first watched this story when I was a kid, and it was when I was coming to the end of my Doctor Who journey at that particular point in my life. Shame on me. I was going into my teen years, and I was growing ever more interested in violent action films. I was looking in Britannia catalogues and gazing with dumbfounded bewilderment at this new thing called manga, where they were cartoons, but they were 18 rated. And so began my entertainment journey for the next few decades of my life, where Doctor Who was kind of left in the dust. I know, I'm sorry. So when I watched Ghostlight, not only was I kind of slightly bored of Doctor Who in general, but I was completely and utterly oblivious to any of the interesting things going on here. It just passed me by. The only scene I can remember is when that person is trapped in the door and the Doctor is going, there, now, patting it on the arm. And I'm thinking to myself, what the hell is going on in this story? The 12-year-old me just wasn't interested. But now I am older, wiser, and fully invested back in the classic world of Doctor Who. So I watched it again for the first time in 30 years, and good God, I'm old. Obviously, everything's changed now. Yes, I love this story. But it did make me wonder how even the seasoned Doctor Who fan would have perceived this story at the time of its transmission back in 1989. And I gathered a bit of a clue as to what the general consensus of this story was when I found an old 1990 edition of Doctor Who mag. So this story was written by Mark Platt, who would later go on to make Spare Parts, one of everybody's favourite Big Finish stories. And at the time, he was an avid lover of Doctor Who, but didn't have any writing credentials in the world of TV Doctor Who whatsoever. Like many of the Doctor Who stories before it, the original blueprint for this particular story was something completely different. It actually involved the Doctor landing on Gallifrey and meeting some of his old Gallifreyan buddies, and it was pitched to be a somewhat quirky story in its own right as far as I could tell, but in the end, the eventual product we got kind of shifted the focus onto the Doctor and instead made Ace one of the main driving forces of the narrative of Ghostlight. Anyway, researching for this story led me to this particular issue of Doctor Who magazine, where I found a huge write-up all about this story. Here are a couple of paragraphs. By May 1989, the story had been retitled Ghostlight, and now firmly concerned Ace, conquering her fears instead of the Doctor facing his. It was now a very rapidly moving, multi-layered affair, in which at times the audience was required to deduce connections between strands of plot. With timing cuts forced upon the final edit of the episodes, this narrative became even more hidden in places, causing some adverse reaction from some viewers unable to follow the story. During rehearsals, the cast queried much of the story and the motivations behind their characters, with Waring, that's Alan Waring, the director of this story, ringing Platt on one occasion to find out what was going on in the story. Eventually, the cast felt completely happy with the storyline, but had fears that the audience, who lacked their insight, would lose track of the programme. And this is an interesting thing to keep in mind, because I did eventually manage to get on board fully with this story, but it's only because I was watching it able to freeze frame, jump back continuously, and switch the subtitles on and off at my behest. Now obviously, when this story was originally transmitted, people did have VHS and there was 888 subtitles on the telly, but that doesn't necessarily mean people would have watched this as strenuously as I did. They wouldn't really have had any reason to record this and continuously rewind and fast forward, or put the subtitles on and off when they were watching this live, so you can't really expect anyone to have studied this story as diligently as somebody like me would have done in 2025. Certain other scenes were filmed to add extra context to some of the more obscure story beats, but these were edited out or never completed, which meant that the potential to understand certain bits of this story was unfortunately lost. So what we have is a penetrable puzzle box, but a puzzle box nonetheless. But the real question is it good? Yeah, it's great. Let's get into it. Okay, before we begin, please let me remind you that just because I understand the story doesn't mean it's easy to explain. It's really not easy to explain at all, but I'll give it a go. This is Stanton Court in Weymouth, Dorset, except it's not. It's the house of Gabriel Chase in 1883. Cool exterior shot. You see the same shot of that building from the outside at nighttime, at daytime, and during dawn and dusk, and you've even got some cool lighting effects superimposed at certain points. Other than this far away, underneath, foreboding exterior shot, everything, and I mean everything in this story, is set within the walls of this house. And that, of course, is awesome. A small, finite location. Great sets in this one. Everything looks claustrophobic and just generally weird. It's great. The sanctity of this mansion has been somewhat disturbed ever since its original owner, George Pritchard, disappeared, leaving his wife, Mrs. Pritchard, and their daughter, Gwendolyn, alone with a cast of other somewhat bizarre characters. These include Josiah Smith, a researcher, collector, and radical thinker with aspirations to, well, we'll get to that. You've also got Nimrod, a Neanderthal/butler. There's an army of maids, and yeah. Come on, chimp, you can do better than that. There is also a weird creature behind a door. The mansion is visited by a Reverend Ernest Matthews, a stuck-up fuddy-duddy in his own right, and here is here as a representative of the Royal Society of Natural Philosophers to debunk the somewhat Darwinist radical thinking of Josiah Smith. Meanwhile, the TARDIS lands in a Victorian playroom full of weird Victorian toys and taxidermy with eyes that light up. It is actually revealed in a deleted scene that these eyes light up because they are in fact surveillance cameras, but the humble viewer is none the wiser. It's just a weird thing that happens. Like so many other weird things in this story, we haven't even scratched the surface yet. On immediately exploring the mansion, the Doctor and Ace run into another character, Redvers Ven Cooper, a supposed representative of the Royal Geographical Society and also a hunter. At the moment he is attempting to hunt down, well, himself, as it turns out. He is actually being held prisoner in this mansion ever since he saw something so traumatic it has rendered him prone to bouts of schizophrenia and paranoid delusion. They keep him in a straitjacket, the poor fella. Through a number of encounters and a small bout of mistaken identity, the Doctor and Ace eventually become guests in the house. There's no real scene where they get apprehended or the police are called upon them. They're just there and we just gotta run with it, I guess. During this particular part of the first episode, Josiah, who is clearly running the show here, attempts to strike a rapport with the Doctor. He even wants to hire the Doctor to kill Queen Victoria. The reason for this is that he is such a radical thinker that he is completely and utterly critical towards the industrialisation of modern Britain of that era. He hates the fog and the smog and the monarchy and the factories and everything else, and he wants to tear it all down and rebuild it with his own designs in mind. And I suppose in terms of a working class perspective, the people who were the most downtrodden in that particular era of Britain's history, there is a certain element of righteousness and justification for this idea. However, the Doctor sees right through the maniacal nature of this plan and believes it to be no better than the version of Britain that society already has. So Ace has been ordered to dress into something more appropriate, and she does what she tends to do in this scenario. She She buddies up with the nearest other young female companion, and then they go off on a slightly rebellious crusade of their own, shedding their current garments to dress like gentlemen. So alongside all of the surreal and blink and you'll miss it moments of this episode, there are two major swerves here that change the game completely for this story. The first is that it turns out the Doctor brought Ace here deliberately, kind of for her own good, or at least he sees that in his eyes. This mansion is in fact intrinsically linked to a pivotal moment of Ace's life. This is a mansion that Ace explored way forward in the 1980s when she was a 13-year-old girl. And interestingly enough, this comes in the backdrop of an unfortunate incident that happened to one of her friends, Misha. Her friend Misha was subject to racist abuse from the local Scallies when they set fire to her house. And this enraged a young Ace so much to the point where she snuck into this mansion just to cause a bit of chaos and misbehave. It is an interesting and three-dimensional bit of backstory for Ace's character in this episode, even if it is mentioned within just one quick line that you could quite easily miss. So she went into this mansion, and that is when she discovered something so sinister and scary she simply does not want to talk about. The Doctor has offered her the chance to reconcile with her demons, and she rejects this, saying she will only do that on her own terms. Swerve number 2. The underground chamber of this mansion is actually a spaceship, and this spaceship is hardwired to the entirety of the mansion. Everything weird that's happening in this mansion is happening because of this ship, and that in itself is a fairly linear, easy to understand concept. And great set, by the way. I love the look of everything in this story. The fact that this is a room shrouded in curtains, and when those curtains lift up, you are instantly transported into a completely different atmosphere. It's the entire dynamics and the lore of this story shifts with one literal lift of the curtain. It is a twist done right as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, if only it were that simple, but it isn't. Ace goes down to explore the ship and she finds two giant humanoid bugs in suits. Why not? It's because John Nathan Turner wanted the added component of alien-looking creatures in this story just because it's Doctor Who, and there they are. But the ruffle in these creatures is that they are husks. They are cast-off shells of Josiah Smith, who is an alien. He came down on board with this ship. He is surveying this planet and studying its life forms, hence the reason why he has such radical notions. He's constantly evolving into newer forms. The bugs, which for some reason are still alive in and of themselves, are actually shed skins of Josiah, and Josiah is continuing to evolve. So the house is full of taxidermy and specimens, butterflies, moths, beetles. They would later come to life and start walking around, and you know, they do that because they just do, and you're just going to have to appreciate that and enjoy it. So there's a policeman in a drawer that Gwendolyn opens. She's kind of like, it's time to wake up the policeman. We need a detective to help us figure out what's going on here. Even though the Doctor is fully on board of everything going on here, it's Sylvester McCoy's Doctor. Because Sylvester McCoy's Doctor, he is the cosmic jester. One of the most appealing parts of his character is that he knows stuff that the audience don't. He is a master chess player in his own right, and that is something that I will get back to later in the story when I have explained all the other bizarre stuff that goes on. So at the beginning of the episode, Josiah is undergoing another transformation. He is in the process of shedding off his old grey-haired form, and he is having a conversation with a still very sceptical Reverend Ernest, and completely scoffs at Josiah Smith's idea that mankind evolved from a monkey and that evolution is a thing. But boy, is he in store for a nasty surprise, because once eating a banana spiked with some kind of chemical, he begins to de-evolve into an ape, a hairy ape. who gets put in a cage and then sent off to Java. Java seems to be the destination where Josiah Smith sends anybody who interferes with his plans. If you interfere with Josiah's plans, you either get put in a drawer, sent off to Java, or put in a straitjacket and held prisoner. He's got lots of different ways to dispatch his enemies. And this particular enemy, he turns into a monkey and put in a cage. Sorry, I said monkey, I actually meant ape. And if you ever wondered what happened to this ape version of Reverend Ernest, well, I'm pleased to tell you that he had a big shave, regressed into a younger, more handsome fella, and then proceeded to make numerous videos covering Doctor Who for YouTube and Cybermen. I still adore a good banana. What else is happening? Yeah, they break the screen in the ship, so some light escapes and everything goes a bit chaotic. From there on in, we discover the existence of light, a superior being that is the real driving force of everything that's happening here. Josiah Smith was a simple passenger working for Light, and he has settled in nicely into Earth. And his plan to take over the British Empire does not coincide with the overall plans of Light, hence the reason why Josiah is determined to keep his boss prisoner so he can basically go about achieving his own goals. The Doctor is having none of it. He wants to thwart Josiah's plans at every turn and release Light just so we can have a conversation to find out what is truly going on here. Anyone who's watched this will probably naturally gravitate to one of these supporting characters in particular. Despite Fenn Cooper, who is also a likeable guy in his own right, as we will see as the story progresses, one of the most noble and pleasant people is the Neanderthal Nimrod. He is literally a Neanderthal from a Neanderthal tribe, by the way. Light visited Nimrod's Neanderthal tribe and scooped him up and kept him aboard his ship, where he kind of developed talking skills and became a much more sort of modern sentient creature than he was originally. That was the gift that Light gave him, hence the reason why he worships Light and the reason why Josiah fears Light so much. And the Doctor is so eager to meet Light, and he knows that Light won't come until midnight, so he kind of forces the process by turning the clock to midnight, which in essence creates a kind of midnight scenario. Despite the protests of Josiah, Light appears, and you might think that looks kind of naff, but you've got to keep in mind that this is simply the form that Light chose so he could communicate on a kind of level playing field with the human subjects and the Doctor. The actual real Light in his original form presumably is something so bizarre and otherworldly that us mortal humans haven't got the mental capacity to fully comprehend it, I guess. Light was a being who came to Earth and surveyed it, cataloguing every kind of species that he could find. But the problem that he found was the very concept of evolution and the fact that that means that things change. And Light was frustrated because that meant his catalogue was rendered obsolete, and now he has this somewhat sinister plan to reduce the entire Earth into soup as a kind of childish sort of ha-ha action. Oh, that police inspector that was in the drawer, he gets turned into soup as well. They go for a big meal and the Doctor says to Ace, don't eat the soup, and Ace doesn't. And it's a good job she didn't, because as it turns out, it was the policeman. Light might seem like a noble, godly being, but he's not noble at all. He's horrible. He dispatches one of the maids, and next time you see him, he's got the maid on the table and he's holding a severed arm.
I wanted to see how it works.
Yeah, of course you did. He is a self-centered and wicked little creature in his own right, no better than Josiah. They are both as bad as each other in essence, and the only inhabitant of that ship is a person called Control, who has a somewhat savage mindset and is walking around in a shroud, but then reveals herself to be a humanoid-looking lady, and Ace teaches her the values of elegance and speech, which she picks up remarkably quickly. She then ascends to become something more noble and pleasant and better than the actual inhabitants of the ship. It is the supposedly broken, inferior, downtrodden, uneducated characters who eventually shine like stars in this story. Fen Cooper was originally supposed to be clinically insane, yet he gathers a wisdom that the other characters can't seem to parallel. Control was meant to be a shrouded, uncultured wretch hiding in the shadows, but then she becomes an elegant lady in her own right. Nimrod, who was sworn to a life of servitude, realizes above all else the sanctity of precious life. Likewise, the characters who supposedly had the superior level of intellect and wisdom are shown for the two-dimensional children that they are. Josiah Smith, for example, who has spent the whole story either cruelly dispatching his enemies or to keep those closest to him under his boot, is now subjected to the same fate that befell Control. He is now the animal, kept on a leash and sworn to do nothing but as he is told. And the heads of Josiah's husks blow up. Cool. As for Light himself, he is defeated and dispersed by the Doctor, cursing him to haunt the mansion for the rest of his days, and it is only then, right at the end of this story, that the title of this adventure actually makes sense. Ghost Light. Very clever. So it turns out that Ace visited this mansion in the 1980s and discovered the haunting presence of Light, and that is what freaked her out so much that she actually set fire to this mansion and burnt it to the ground. That is her dark story, her ultimate act of rebellion. And it's interesting as well because you don't actually see any flashbacks in any real form of this event from Ace's childhood, as you probably would if this was a story made in modern Doctor Who. But what you do get in the final episode is this kind of journey into the past where she walks through a corridor and the elements of the mansion seem to crash in on her. The light changes and she kind of rebels against the forces that are forcing her to confront her past, and then she crouches and you hear police sirens and a flashing blue light upon her, and that is a clever way of superimposing the past onto this character without having to transport the audience into any other kind of location. A nice little blending, I think. Anyway, the Doctor and Ace both have a simultaneous reconciliation with the past here right at the end, and this is one of the most beautiful moments, I think. Ace sits on the steps and the Doctor asks her, "Do you regret setting fire to it?" And Ace replies by saying, "No, I wish I'd blown it up instead." And the Doctor simply says, "Wicked." I love this for two reasons. One is that it shows that Ace really has no regrets on her rebellious outburst. After all, she was a child and it was in the past a long time ago. I'm not recommending that anyone set fire to anything, but it works within the context of this story, the fact that she is able to move on and reconcile, and likewise the Doctor passes no judgment on the fact that this is how Ace has decided to leave this element of her past in the dust. He instead approves of this eventual reconciliation by saying "wicked," her own catchphrase. Perfect writing, excellent stuff. And I like the fact that Sylvester McCoy ad-libbed this and decided to change the line to "wicked" last minute. And that is the story of Ghost Light as best as I can describe it. That was really hard work. I don't doubt I've missed the odd surreal moment and story beat somewhere along the lines, but you get the idea. I think it's more important to talk about the themes. You see, when I was covering this and studying this story, I kind of deduced that the most important theme and the most important takeaway from this story was in fact the concept of change. Like, the idea of evolution is the perfect metaphor for change within ourselves. The villainous characters despise the idea of change. They want forms of life and everything else to be shackled to one place and tethered to one time, no matter how bad that is for the individual, whereas each and every one of us knows that to have a good life, it's very important to move on from certain stages, to let go of certain elements of the past, to reconcile with demons in ourselves, to be able to become better people going forward. And this happens to each each and every one of the good characters in this story. You've also got Miss Pritchard and her daughter Gwendolyn, who were able to move on from the fact that they lost their husband and father George, and now they are able to reconcile and move on from that. And there are certain people and certain villains in life and in the real world who will attempt to stop that change, to keep things as they are, to keep people in the same grind over and over and over, so there is no progression, there is no moving forward. And I think that is what Ghostlight teaches us, and that is why I think, for all its surreal, spooky gothicness, it is quite a positive story at the end. And in the epicenter of all this, at the heart of all this, you get the Doctor, who is the grand chess player throughout the entire thing. I can't help thinking that he knew everything that was going to happen from the beginning. There is, of course, a greater story arc going on here with him and Ace, which I just do not have time to go into now. If you want to watch videos where I cover the kind of impossible girl nature of Ace, I will drop them at the end of this video, and I talk briefly about how Ace has her own fascinating story arc, and she is essentially a character out of time, and how she laid the blueprint essentially for characters like Rose Tyler with the bad wolf thing and Clara Oswald with the impossible girl thing. There are other episodes that talk about this briefly, and there's a kind of blink and you'll miss it factor, but it is there. I'm not going to talk about it now because there's just too much to talk about already. That in itself is a story arc that I'd like to cover in more detail one day, maybe in a 12-hour video essay or something. Suffice to say that it culminates in Curse of Fenric, and Ghostlight isn't actually a part of it, despite the fact that it was televised before Curse of Fenric, because it was in fact made after. Ghostlight was the final story to be ever produced in the classic Doctor Who era, so this is a beast unto its own. And I can't help thinking the Doctor was doing the typical Sylvester McCoy 7th Doctor Cosmic Jester thing of playing through events the continuity of which he was already aware of, because he already knew that this was going to happen. And there is actually one small scene that validates to me the idea that the Doctor had already watched Ghostlight and therefore knew everything that was going to happen. There's a moment where Ace is nagging him to explain what's going on, and she nags the Doctor so much that he eventually says, "Quiet." But I don't think he was talking to her.
Professor!
Quiet.
And the music stops. He literally tells the music score to shush. He is operating outside the confines of being a character in the TV show. Kind of like how we almost saw the Doctor do recently in stories like The Devil's Cord, but I'm going to discount that because it never actually went anywhere. So I just think this is an interesting little element, and it might have been put in for a bit of fun, but it kind of turns the whole thing on its head to me and gives credence to the idea that the Doctor is one step ahead of everyone all the time, including the audience. Anyway, that's just a theory, and it's my theory, and it's silly. So I want to know your theories, and I want to know what you thought of Ghostlight. So please get in the comments, tell me what you thought of this serial, tell me what you think it represented, and tell me anything you think I missed whilst talking about this story. And thank you so much for watching this video. Your viewership means a lot, and I will be back next week to talk about some more spooky gothic Doctor Who. In the meantime, you can check me out on social media by visiting my Blue Sky page at thechosenchimp.bsky.social. You can also head over on Patreon at patreon.com/chosenchimp. It is there that you can become a distinguished follower for just £1 a month and request your classic Doctor Who topic for coverage. Your name will be mentioned in the video, and your contribution will go towards making this video a faster, stronger, more bizarre and surreal place in its own right. In the meantime, I wish you all the very best in everything, and please, for the love of Pete and his world, do have a good one.